This is the London Fintech Podcast, bringing you practical insights and approaches, stories and inspiration from the innovators who are building the new world of financial services. This podcast is brought to you by NextWave, strategy specialists and solutions for financial institutions. I'm Tony Clark, and this is the London Fintech Podcast. This show is all about stories of innovation and success from the world of fintech. In today's episode, we're focusing on a fintech with a unique social purpose. Gretel is an asset reunification platform which helps people locate forgotten bank accounts, shares, child trust funds, other financial assets. There are 90 billion of stranded assets in the UK alone, and the number has increased 50% in the last 5 years. So this is a huge problem. Duncan Stevens is an entrepreneur with a social purpose. He's been in the asset reunification industry pretty much all his career and has built Gretel ground up over the last 4 years to a user base which is now in hundreds of thousands and a value reclaimed of tens of millions. Gretel has forged partnerships with major firms such as Aviva, won the title of Consumer Champion at the Money Age Awards, and Duncan was commended in the Entrepreneur of the Year category of the City AM Dragon Awards. He's also been seen on the BBC last week and several other appearances, and I think he's just getting started. So welcome, Duncan.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show, and there's lots to talk about here, I think. So let's get to know you a bit, if we can, just before we sort of get into Gretel. Can you tell us a bit about growing up, your influences, how did you get into asset reunification?
How I got into it is a story of kind of accidental chance, I suppose. My background, my influences kind of growing up, the two people really stand out for me. One was my dad. I mean, both of my parents were clearly very important in my life growing up, but in terms of entrepreneurial influence, my dad, 100%. He was a self-made man. He built businesses, he lost businesses. He taught me a lot about the value of ethics in business. He also taught me what not to do, namely, don't mortgage the house against your business. We've moved a lot growing up, so as a result of my dad's entrepreneurial spirit. I guess there was one moment for me. I was very fortunate growing up that I went to boarding school, but one of those instances when my father's business went under, it collapsed very quickly. An individual trustee of the school, someone I'd never met, I've still never met, who I didn't know, stepped in and paid my school fees for 2 years. That would have been tens of thousands of pounds. I now know who that individual is. He's a very successful Asian businessman, runs one of the biggest banks in the Far East. But that kind of stepping in and helping somebody else, I think, sowed a seed in me, which was actually I want to have a career where I can give back. I didn't know what shape or form that would be. It took me a few years of going off to university to kind of really find what I wanted to do. And then when I graduated, I just decided I'd moved to London to go to university. I wanted to stay in London. And I just happened to find a job in the world of asset reunification, right on the bottom rung of the ladder. And from day one, just loved it. I loved the fact that you could have a very successful business that made good money, but also was helping people along the way. And large numbers of people. So it was something that just ignited a passion in me. And that's kind of lived with me for 26 years. And through the companies that I've worked with, I think we've probably helped somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people and probably given back about £3 billion.
And that's so powerful, that early influence of being on the receiving end of, that generosity, and then not perhaps knowing quite how that was going to manifest later on, but knowing that you wanted to give something back. And we're going to talk some more about Gretel and the social impact that you're having and how the business has been moving on its journey so far. But just before we do that, just talking about the media appearances and the things that you're doing, the little that I've done in research for this show, it's clear that you're very busy. But when you're off duty, what do you do to unwind and rebalance?
I've got lots of people. I have a dog. I love walking my dog twice a day. I think when you sit at a desk all the time and you're very focused on what you're doing, and being a startup founder is a 24/7 job. You don't have time for much else. Getting time to go out and walk my dog is a great relief for a couple of hours a day. On the odd chance where I do get some free time, I love going to concerts. I'm a big kind of rock music, kind of heavy metal kind of fan. I'm also a very keen photographer. So I love to take every opportunity. In addition to kind of having tens of thousands of photos on my iPhone, I've also got a professional camera. I go out wherever I can, and kind of being out this morning when in a sunrise with mist over the hills of South London, it was beautiful.
Rock and metal. You've got the wrong LFP host. So Mike Ballerman, who invented this show, ran the first 10 years. It's the side story. But when I took over the show, there were various logins to some of the assets that we used to to create these episodes, and most of the logins were based on heavy metal rock bands. So I think you'd have a fellow fan there.
And this is very much an aside. I think before I found my social purpose, my first 2 jobs out of school were working for global rock bands.
Oh.
Touring. I've been on stage in front of 100,000 people. I've been to amazing events, amazing parties. I met some incredible people. Right up until my dad basically sat me down and said, "Look, you realise how much I spent on your education. You are going to university."
Yeah.
And then the rest is history.
Well, you might find yourself on stage in front of lots of people again, I think, going forward, given the progress that Gretel's making. And you talked a little bit about getting into the asset reunification space and liking the fact that there's a purpose to the industry in early career, but you've also been successful through your corporate journey up until you became a founder. So what prompted you to take the leap into entrepreneurship? And as I understand it, it was immediately sort of prior to COVID as well.
It was. I'd always described myself, I think, reflecting back on my career as an entrepreneur. I was in big businesses, big corporate life, but I never quite fitted in that world. I was always very, I guess you ask my bosses, they'd give you a better idea. I was always pretty challenging. I always had ideas. I always wanted to make change happen. But I was also quite successful in building businesses within businesses. I'd had a couple of chances earlier in my career to kind of step out and do it for myself, but never really wanted to just replicate what somebody else was doing. And that was the kind of the limitation of my ideas previously. The idea for Gretel came about because I'd done some work with government for a couple of years. I'd been part of a government initiative that was creating a new framework of legislation around my industry. And there were a couple of learnings that I got from that specifically led to Gretel. One was actually there is no universal solution out there for the whole industry. And by and large, most financial services firms are very limited in what they can do because the cost of the tools that they had available to them was so prohibitive. So we wanted to create something that was universal, was incredibly easy for consumers to access, and also very affordable for firms. The timing of it, therefore, was I got to a point where I just, again, with being an entrepreneur, you get itchy feet. And it's not that I didn't love the businesses that I worked for. I absolutely did. I had some amazing friends, amazing bosses along the way, but I just wanted to do more. And I had this burning desire that I wanted to do something. And when you look at some of the numbers out there of the scale of the problem, and even when I think over kind of 10, 15 years, I've helped so many people through those other businesses, but we've barely scratched the surface. So we've got to do it differently. I do remember thinking back, though, to I think it was this first or second week of January, seeing on the news kind of rumors of some flu epidemic in China and thinking, well, that sounds really horrible. 3 weeks later, I left my job at the end of January 2020. And 8 weeks later, we were all going into lockdown for the first time. It's one of those things, I think, had I realized how long that would take to play out and the impact it would have on us as a business, I perhaps wouldn't have jumped ship. But, I'm incredibly glad that I did. I don't think I will ever go back to it because this has ignited a passion in me for doing things for myself. There's a freedom to doing it. There's a lot of risk. It's a proper roller coaster. But yeah, making that decision was an easy one. The timing of it was probably quite comedic, I think, to look back on at the time. But I always believe, there's a silver lining to everything, right? And I remember thinking when everyone was going into lockdown and people were being furloughed, there was a lot of talk about the stress that was putting on people, the uncertainty of not knowing whether they would have a job, whether they could survive, whether they would be happy working from home. And I remember thinking, well, you know what? To start up the business, at least I've left work with 18 months worth of savings and I've made a decision to work from home. So we might not get any support from the government because we're so new, but these are my circumstances anyway. So, make the best of it.
Look, that resonates on so many levels. It's almost, and it's a separate conversation, it's almost a parallel story. When we launched Next Wave Consulting, our first fees were in January and then lockdown was in March. My runway was almost like the same amount of time, and you just have to jump in with both feet. So you tell 3 people you're doing it, you come up with a name, and then it becomes a thing, and away you go. And there's certainly no looking back. But I recognise the roller coaster journey. From our part, we've been on a different roller coaster, but equally exciting with a few highs and lows. But anyway, we're not here to talk about that. You're clearly a man on a mission. I'm just listening to that intro. I gather you were actually offered a job back in corporate a few weeks after you started. Is that right?
Yes, about 6 months, 6 to 8 months in the middle of all the lockdowns, a former boss of mine got in touch and offered me the chance to have my old job back with a fairly decent pay rise. At the time, I think like many initial startup founders, myself and my co-founders were drawing no salary. But we had our mission. We were loving it for all the headwinds we were going through. We were definitely not alone. I mean, every startup goes through headwinds. Every startup has challenges with runway, with sales. Everything takes longer. Everything costs more. But I'd found my purpose. And I think that's money always matters. Being able to pay the bills matters. But if you've got purpose, actually, you can rebalance so much of the things in your life. Money's not the most important thing at that point. It's actually the impact of what you're doing.
And you find a way, and it's surprising what comes out of the woodwork, and who finds you, and then what the opportunities
Completely.
that come
Yes.
from that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about Gretel. In simple terms, what does the platform do, and can you give us some examples of the impact that it's having on your consumers and your client base?
For sure. So we, in very simple terms, we are the UK's biggest platform to help members of the public for free reconnect with billions of pounds worth of lost money. We are completely unique in the fact that we cover all financial sectors, and that gives us a very diverse appeal, very diverse user base. We have grown. We launched kind of April 22, so we were about a year later than we wanted to be, primarily because of COVID. We launched, we had a couple of clients on the books at the time, some early adopters, a few hundred beta tester users, and we've grown over the course of the last 2.5 years to, as you said earlier, to hundreds of thousands of users now. We've got some huge kind of blue chip clients on the books, and for many of those clients, I think it's safe to say that we have become an integral part of what they would call a customer reconnection journey, helping their customers reconnect with them, because it's a difficult process for many of them. It's why 75% of our clients, our customers, have increased the scope of what they do with us, because a lot of them, they'll pick a particular product that's a painful area for them. They'll stick that on our platform, and then they'll see that the process works, and then they'll start adding more and more. From a consumer perspective, the impact's really clear to measure. I mean, as you said, it's tens of millions of pounds that we've handed out to people, but there are notable stories of people with Alzheimer's who have run out of money, where we come along with the help of family members on their side and find them sometimes tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of pounds. And the single biggest amount that we've given out to someone was about £168,000.
Wow.
The average per person is in the thousands, but there's also individuals. I remember there was a story of a single mother who had separated from her partner. They'd had a child. She went overseas. She ended up living in, I think it was in Hong Kong. She was on a trip back to the UK trying to find her daughter's child trust fund, had no idea where to look because she'd been gone for over a decade. And within the space of 3 minutes with Gretel, found exactly where the money was, not just where it was, but how much it was, and it was over £10,000 for her daughter that she wouldn't have had otherwise.
That's extraordinary. And I do want to talk some more about how simple the system is to use and how it works. But just before we do that, what's in the name, Gretel?
I'd love to take credit for it. We had a very, very good branding agency that gave us a whole variety of names, and it was the one that we kind of landed on. Ultimately, though, the meaning for us is trail of breadcrumbs. It is the fact that Gretel, for many people in society, will be the trail of breadcrumbs that helps them find their way back to their money. A lot of people don't know where to look. They don't know how to start. And if we can just make it easy for people, that goes to everything that we've designed into the system.
Yeah, and I think that simplicity and ease of use is at the heart of it. So we'll come back to that. In terms of target market, I mean, you gave a couple of examples there, but where are you aiming across society?
I mean, look, anyone in marketing will tell you that you need to have a target market. You need to be very focused on it. We're probably the opposite of that. We are here for everyone. We have high net worths that will use us. We have a lot of people who are kind of would be classified as subprime from a lending perspective. Our users range in age from 18 up to, I think our oldest registered user is 92 years old. And we've got young children, like 11, 12, 13-year-olds, whose parents are registering with us to help them find their child trust funds. So it literally is everyone.
That's brilliant. And you touched on it, but what are the most common type of assets that are searchable that people are finding using the platform?
So I mean, that's an interesting one. Probably the bigger question is actually what are people most commonly searching for? Because what people most often find is determined by which companies are using us. What most people are searching for actually bank accounts first and foremost, then pensions, and then shares. That's we see somewhere in the order of about 70 to 80% of all of the searches that we have on the platform are for those three things.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned examples of that diverse consumer base and some folks who may be elderly or have various challenges interacting with other firms or systems. What have you done to make this inclusive for those who've got memory issues, perhaps, or don't have a credit rating? That accessibility.
When we set out on day one, there were a number of things that we wanted to overcome. The biggest one for us was accessibility. It was whether it was a vulnerability like having Alzheimer's or something like that, or whether it was just kind of poor memory. People of all ages can't remember everything. And so when we started designing Gretel, we did so with inclusivity in mind. We designed for the edge cases. We said, look, if we can design for old people who are not digitally savvy, perhaps as much as kind of people in the middle or certainly younger demographics, if we can make the system work for them and be accessible to them, then it will work for everyone. And equally, if we do it for young people who don't have a credit footprint that allows companies to track down where they've moved, if we can solve the problem for them, again, we're going to solve it for everyone. So the whole premise of Gretel was make the journey easy, make sure it requires as little information as possible. If you go on other services to try and track down your lost money, you will invariably be asked, where did you work? Where did you save? Where did you put your money? Where did you live? All of those things. With Gretel, it's just your name, address, and date of birth.
So
We
that's
do
the
the rest.
minimum data set: name,
Yeah.
address, date of birth, and then what happens? So I put my name, address, date of birth in, and I sort of hit submit, and what happens then?
Very simply, you put your name, address, date of birth in, a couple of other bits of information. We will help you identify as many of your past addresses as we can so that you don't have to remember them. Again, that's a bit of a nod to people with poor memory. It's helping them with at least the last kind of 15 to 20 years of their addresses. That will help in most cases. You can then add in more addresses if you like. And in my account within Gretel, I have 50 years worth of addresses. As I mentioned before, but for reasons beyond my control, we moved around a lot when I was younger. I've got 19 different addresses.
Okay.
So possibly not the average person, but it goes to show the kind of the scale of what we can do. Once you've confirmed all of your addresses, the system will immediately do a search for you. So the whole process end to end takes 3 minutes or less. If you find a match, we'll ask you to pass a KYC check to make sure that you are you. And once you've passed that, then we'll show you where your money is. You'll get a dashboard of all of your assets broken down by the different types of products with instructions on exactly what to do to recover your money, how to get it, what evidence you'll need to provide. So basically arming the user with all the information they need to be able to get their money as quickly as possible.
We talked in the intro about a really big market opportunity and that you've only, I think you put it, scratched the surface. But what sort of user volumes are signing up and how much runway do you think you still got to go in the UK on this?
Oh God, I mean, look, there's 28 million lost accounts out there. So, I mean, there's huge scope for us to grow. And we have thousands of people signing up every week. And we have big peak points. You mentioned the media coverage that we get sometimes. We had a particular episode earlier in the year where we had 70,000 people registered in about 4 days. So it can be huge. It is scratching the surface, even with hundreds of thousands of people on the platform, unless they are the hundreds of thousands of people that between them have got 28 million lost products, which would be terrible to think that all these people had lost everything. There's a lot of scope for us to continue growing. And we see this every time. Every time a new company signs up, we match millions of pounds for them instantly. Every time we get a burst of activity and lots of people sign up, we have a knock-on effect across all of our client bases where we match millions of pounds for them.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. So just coming back to that, companies signing up, when I was doing the research for this episode, looking at the model, you use terms like client, and I thought, oh, client, maybe that's the man on the street, but your client is actually Aviva or, big bank. And you're a two-sided marketplace in that you're matching between the institutions and the consumers. So can you tell us a bit more about how that model works?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've described it very, very eloquently. It's a two-sided marketplace. So on the one side, you've got what we call our clients. So the Avivas, the JP Morgans of this world, Phoenix Life have just about to come on board at the moment. So people like that, big financial institutions that have huge customer sets. So they sit on one side of the marketplace. They share their information with us to make it easily accessible for their customers to find. On the other side of it, we have to go out there and then raise awareness with the public to make them want to come and look. The key principle, though, is they don't need to know what they're looking for. They might come to us and say, well, we're looking for a child trust fund with Foresters, for example. Or they might say, look, I think we had an old annuity policy with Aviva. They might not. Most people come to us just simply thinking, I think I might have something out there. And that's all they need to know, because they don't need to direct us on where to search.
So talking about the client in that terminology, so the institution, how do you enroll them? We're thinking these big firms that have got stranded assets worth millions, billions of pounds. Is it a regulatory requirement to try and find the owners, or is it voluntary? What's the driver for the institutions to sign up and open up their data and take part in the platform?
Sharing data in this way and trying to help people find their lost money, that's not a regulated thing. That's not governed by legislation, although there is a legislative framework out there, but it's a voluntary scheme. The dormant asset scheme is voluntary. Many of the biggest firms in the UK, however, have signed up to it and do participate. The simplest thing, though, is actually in the context of financial services and regulated activity, all regulated financial services firms today are regulated under the Consumer Duty. Yeah. And one of the key principles of Consumer Duty is being able to communicate in a timely manner and make information accessible with your customers, none of which you can do if you've got lost customers. On average, the banks have got about 14 to 16% of their customer base that will be lost. That might not sound like a big percentage, but if you're a big bank, that could be millions of people, millions of your customers that you cannot communicate with.
14 to 16%. Well, this explains why you were consumer champion at the Money Age Awards, and Consumer Duty presumably has provided quite a boost to the business.
It absolutely has, yeah. Certainly in the last kind of 6 months or so, we've seen a definite uptick in volume and speed of companies wanting to get on board, because that's when a lot of the legacy old pots and products came into scope. One of the key things that we did when we were designing Gretel was to say, how can we make this as easy for firms as possible? Whenever you talk to firms, the first thing that comes up is technology roadmap. We've got a lot on our roadmap. It's going to be 2 years before we can even consider this. And our simple answer is, we only need the same data that you would currently share with a credit bureau for data cleansing purposes. We need no technology integration, and our contracts are pretty boilerplate. So you can get started. We've had the fastest client onboarding has been about 7 to 8 weeks.
That's remarkable. On previous episodes, we talked to fintech founders and we talk about, mice dancing with elephants and the misalignment between product development pace and onboarding at a fintech level versus an enterprise level. And really like how you sort of unpack that, the connection with the institution, because outside in, you'd think, yeah, absolutely, crikey, that's going to be a massive supplier onboarding process and complex API discussions and data exchanges that could drag on and on. But you've made it as accessible on the institution side as you have on the consumer side.
We've done our bit, for sure. I would love to say that every client is as quick as the one that did it in kind of 7 to 8 weeks. Just to balance that off, we've had instances where we met with the client, we got told afterwards that the bosses were exchanging WhatsApp messages saying, this is a complete no-brainer. What then ensued following that decision to go ahead was 18 months of due diligence.
Oof.
That took us 3 weeks.
Yeah.
But everything else sat client side, and it was just them going through the various levels of sign-off. I've never heard mice dancing with elephants before, but it's a Mexican standoff between the fintech and the big firm. It's often actually, can the startup last long enough to actually win those clients? Because there's no doubt in my mind that those clients want to do it. It's just their processes are just not geared for it.
It's such a big thing in the sector. So for the enterprise audience listening to this show, this is still a thing. And it's whether you're a fintech with a SaaS service or you're a consulting supplier, and I can talk from that standpoint. So there can be pockets of hyper innovation in the institutions, and they can be leading with AI and machine learning and doing really cool stuff. But the supplier and the partner onboarding flows can be just tortuous. Not always, but we've had 14, 16-month processes on the consulting side, and we're not even onboarding anything that's got any data exchange or a product attached to it.
But we've just learned to be very careful with what we say to our investors, because it's very easy as a founder to get carried away on the crest of the wave when you think something's about to land. And we've learned through painful experience not to tell investors too early.
Yeah. And Gretel is a for-profit organization. I think you're clear on that, albeit one with a huge social impact. How does the business model work? Presumably the institutions are paying something to be on the platform.
So we've made it such that we are arguably the most scalable solution that any of these financial institutions can tap into. We do it on an annual license basis. It's like a fixed fee, and all you can eat buffet. Chuck as much data at us as you like, and with that allows us to be able to offer the service then for free to the public. And we get lots of members of the public. I remember when I was launching in the very early days, I'd be out walking my dog and telling people what we do and being really passionate about it. And I'd say that it was free, and they went, "Yeah, but so how much do you charge then?" I'm like, no, it's free.
Yeah.
But you take a commission on what you find, right? I'm like, no, it's free. And there is a genuine skepticism in society, and rightly so. There are a lot of firms out there that will prey on people with get-rich-quick schemes.
Yeah, we've seen it, sort of PPI reclaims, and, very easy to sign up, but a 30% cut or something. And I can understand the skepticism. And I love the simplicity of this model. And it really is championing the consumer, because there's nothing to lose here. And in fact, what I'll be doing after this recording, which is, was it name, address, and date of birth? And
that's it, yeah.
Let's see. See if there's any money down the back of the sofa. So talking about enrolling the consumers, how do you make people aware and bring them to the platform, given that there's so much more opportunity out there for individuals to be repatriated with assets that they just might not know about or have lost?
So there's three key ways in which we do it. We have amazing partnerships with third parties where we share a kind of a social vision. An example of that would be ClearScore. So they regularly promote us to their millions of users. So that's one way where we kind of proactively push out to raise awareness. We do lots of media stuff, obviously, and it's not always television or radio or anything like that, but we're in the press a lot. And that helps raise awareness. It might just be that we're talking about the issue and it's making somebody think, well, that might be me. But then probably the biggest of all of these actually is the client companies themselves. So it's actually having most of the clients that we work with actually completely get the benefit to their customers of talking about the fact they're working with Gretel.
So when they sign up and on board, they then market that to their
It's arguably the one clause in our contract that raises the most eyebrows, because most firms, from a legal perspective, most of their legal teams are completely anti giving somebody else the permission to market the fact that they're working with that brand. Yeah. And we said, but it's completely in your interest.
Yeah.
Not only telling the public that you're working with us, that will draw people in, that will help them find money that they've got with you. But it's more than that. If you, as an organization, tell all of your customers, forget the ones who are lost and disconnected, you tell all of your customers that you have the marketing permissions to write about Gretel, a proportion of those will go off and find money with other firms. So you're actually helping the financial well-being of your customers, even where they're not disconnected from you.
Yeah, and headlining consumer positive behaviors and all of those things. And it's such an interesting twist, because those supplier contracts usually say you're not allowed to say you're working with the institution, and let alone the institution will actually advertise that they're working with the fintech and supplier. And in your case, it's both, right? Both parties are incentivized to get out there and tell the good story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had one of our early adopting clients actually had the clause removed, and we were embargoed from ever talking publicly that they were working with us. They also decided that they would start out by giving us just a very small pot of data, pots of customer information, and it was stuff that they'd worked to death to try and kind of repatriate with their customers. And I remember saying to them, you haven't just given us a needle in the haystack, and a haystack that we can't even tell people doesn't exist. You've given us a bunch of rusty needles because you haven't even given us stuff which is kind of virgin territory that no one else has had a go at. It's the worst of all worlds, yet we did what we do, and we managed to match millions of pounds for them. It wasn't huge numbers of customers that we helped, but it proved to them that actually, even in those circumstances, it works because people don't need to know what they're looking for. And from that, they've basically gone, okay, where else can we go? What more can we do? They now are one of the biggest advocates for us. Their PR team is all over it.
Love that. You've really turned it around. And you talked about doing lots of media and, in a small way, London Fintech Podcast will be part of that. I also know that you've popped up on television quite a bit recently. So tell us a little bit about that. And from our conversation ahead of this episode, I think there might be some quite interesting TV opportunities ahead because there's so much human interest story in every case here.
Yeah, I think there is so much human interest in what we do. The stories of the impact that we can have on people's everyday lives is what really kind of sells it. But then add into that the fact that we can track results real time. We were part of an ITV documentary earlier in the spring. We had some good results off it. I sent a message to one of the crew involved and said, look, coming up to the end of the show, we've matched about £1 million. And that was kind of the end of it. And then we popped up on Good Morning Britain the following day. I was watching the show. I got a heads up that it was going to be on. And we had about 4 minutes, 20 seconds of the hosts talking about Gretel and the impact and their own personal stories about what we do and even spelling out our name. That was the bit where I think in the kind of 3 or 4 days that followed, 70,000 people signed up. Partly because we got the name check, but mostly because one of the amazing hosts, who I'm sure you'll be aware of, Kate Garraway, whose husband sadly died earlier this year, having suffered from long COVID for a number of years. She was just telling her story. And she was just saying that Derek's passed away. I've done the basics of trying to find where his lost pensions are and things like that. She said, but it's difficult. It's really hard. You don't know all the information and companies don't make it easy for you. That was the bit that resonated with the public. We were just a byproduct. We were just the thing that was there to help them in the background.
I haven't seen that segment and I didn't know the Kate Garraway story, but I mean, that would just have such power. That's an enormous platform. Good Morning Britain's on in our house every morning, and I'm going to go back and watch that segment. But it's that sort of exposure that's going to drive the business forward. So TV plans going forward. I mean, when we spoke earlier, you touched on it. I don't know how much you can say, but I think, there's a lot more potential runway, I think, for getting out in that broadcast format.
There absolutely is. Going back to the human impact story, we've got 2 or 3 television production companies talking to us about commissioning a series. Whether that will come to anything, I don't know. It's been done before, but in a kind of an old school kind of way. I mean, I love the idea of it just because it will give individuals the opportunity to tell their story, and it will be those individuals telling their story that resonates with other people that makes them want to go and search as well. It won't be me or any of my team talking about what we do. It will be the individuals sharing their story and being brave enough to talk about that. There's also talk about doing more work with some of the firms some of the organisations we've already worked with. So we've previously filmed with BBC. We have filmed with ITV. So there's talk with a number of those about what more we could do together to kind of build on what we've already done, whether that be at national level, regional level. I quite like the idea of going regional. Some of the firms that we work with are quite regional, and it would give us an opportunity to go into a given network area and say, if you ever had an account of this kind with any of these firms, this is where you need to go. And you can actually track it in real time, by the minute, by the hour, actually how much money, by the end of that show, how much money have you given back to society as a result.
It's brilliant. That sort of media exposure this early in a fintech journey and with a completely consumer first purpose. So it's genius on every level. So Gretel's clearly got a bright future ahead, and you are amongst a small but growing, I think, group of fintechs that's really hyper focused on the social impact. Just curious, are there other fintechs out there that you think are doing an amazing job that you sort of track in your network as well, with the same sense of purpose and societal impact?
I think we've drawn inspiration for Gretel from a number of different quarters. Not all fintechs. I mean, I've already mentioned one that we work with in ClearScore. the success they've had, the growth they've had is nothing short of phenomenal. We know the leadership team there, we know the founder, we love working with them, and they are very, very driven by social impact. They're actually one of the founders of a thing called the Fintech Pledge 2025. And the whole purpose of that is to bring together fintechs that are having a positive impact on consumers. In their own regard, it could be improving someone's credit score, it could be helping people manage their way out of debt, it could be people like us doing what we do, but they and Zopa Bank were the ones that came up with the idea for it. We were one of the early adopters to sign up to it, and there are now dozens of firms that are part of that ecosystem trying to deliver a social kind of positive impact to tens of millions of people by 2025.
Love that. So check out the FinTech Pledge, and kudos to ClearScore and to Zopa for getting that rolling. Looking a bit more ahead, you're in the UK so far, you're identifying assets for end consumers directly, and there's lots that have yet to be matched. But I would think there's also quite some potential for expansion. What are your thoughts, into other areas or other places? What are your thoughts on that?
At this time of year, hot countries would be my vote, clearly. Joking aside, it's an issue around kind of unclaimed money, lost money that is universal around the world. I think there was some research that was done a few years ago by one of the big consultancies. About 46% of OECD countries have existing or planned legislation in this space. The big markets are North America, so US, Canada, close to home, Ireland, France, Germany, places like that, where a lot of expats go and live, South Africa, Australia, Asia. I mean, you name it, it's kind of everywhere. We built Gretel ultimately in a modular way so that we could take it into other jurisdictions with the minimal amount of fuss. But there are some big considerations that we need to bear in mind when we do that, because it's a big undertaking to do it, costs a lot of money, and you need to think about how you're actually going to tap into those customers, because we won't. I think it would be fair to say we're not going to get the same amount of television coverage, media coverage in all of those jurisdictions that we do here. So we need to find a different way of getting in front of consumers.
Yeah, and is the biggest lift on going somewhere else, is that really reaching the consumer base, or is it changing the platform at the back end and regionalizing it or localizing it for the market?
Undoubtedly reaching the consumer base. That is the biggest single challenge. And I think when some of those countries that I mentioned, there'll be some of those where we could do near enough a lift and drop, and we could put boots on the ground and we could do it. Some of them we could even run from the UK quite comfortably, just with some changes to the back end of the platform. Some of them are more challenging. North America's particularly challenging. It's a very mature market for what we do. No one's doing what we do. But as a market, it's vast. It's massively fragmented. So the key consideration there actually is probably one of distribution. How do we just get in front of as many people as possible?
Yeah, and if you were to put a pin in the map then as to where you were going to go next, can you say where that's going to be?
I can't with any certainty say where it's going to be. All I can say is we are having conversations at the moment with financial institutions that are interested in Ireland, North America, and Australia.
Okay, plenty to work with there.
I vote for Australia. I'll go there 6 months of the year to get some nice weather. I could do with a tan for once. But no, we'll go where the demand
October to March, perhaps every year.
Yes, absolutely. We'll go where the market demand is. We know that in the UK, for financial services firms, international customers are a real challenge. No one's cracked it. We have the opportunity to do that. We're working with a couple of firms to try and do that. We're keen to kind of hear from others in the industry to say, actually, tell us which countries you've got an issue in, and we'll focus on those areas. The reality is we'll probably focus on a small number of countries where the biggest amount of the problem is. It's the general 80-20 rule. So we want to solve 80% of the problem with kind of 20% of the countries that we go into. We don't need to deploy Gretel in every single country around the world.
Well, maybe you'll get some inquiries off the back of this episode. Believe it or not, this show has been downloaded in, I think, 180 countries. Now, some of those are probably single-figure downloads and might not be your target market, covering all the major locations. So it's a pretty diverse audience.
The big financial services firms in South America, and then great.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if you're listening to this, there's an amazing platform in Gretel. And please do reach out to Duncan. You mentioned new distribution models. So we talked about media and advertising and making people aware, but presumably you can use intermediaries as well.
Yeah, we absolutely can. I mean, there would be opportunities to embed what we have in terms of technology into other people's offerings potentially. We don't really do the white label journey today. We have one exception for a trade association here in the UK. So we partnered very early on with the Investment Association for the kind of asset and wealth management world. So they have a white labeled version of what we do. We offered it to other trade associations. They had other considerations to kind of bear
Yeah.
in mind. I think for us, there's clearly a question mark around actually embedding what we do into somebody else's offering for some of those countries. America might be one of those.
Yeah, you said that's very fragmented and distributed. So if you're tapping into a distribution network that already got the coverage,
We've seen through the work that we've done with ClearScore that when you do embed and when you tell consumers about it, the click-through rate that we get when ClearScore talk about us is in the high 70%. I mean, it's huge. If you were to embed what we have into something in North America, for example, that already had hundreds of millions of people using it, then you quite comfortably get a target audience that you were after much more easily than if you were trying to do it with boots on the ground.
yeah, those sort of power partnerships where you've got the scale and the reach can be transformational. So I don't know whether the LFP episode will get shared quite so widely, but again, folks listening to this know someone who should know about Gretel, then please do make sure you share it around. So we're running a little short on time, so I will sort of bring this to a conclusion and perhaps step back and reflect on some takeaways. You've made everyone aware of what Gretel is doing. It's a remarkable journey so far, and a very successful one, I'd say. So what advice would you perhaps give to listeners who have unclaimed assets? Let's talk about the consumer for a second first. So you might not even know you've got unclaimed assets, but what advice would you give to the consumer at large who doesn't know where to start?
Other than the obvious one of sign up to Gretel, clearly, I think there are a number of things that people can do. I mean, there are other services out there. If you are specifically looking for things like pensions, you can go on gov.uk. There's a pension tracing service you can use. It will need you to put in details of where you've worked in order to find it. It's not perfect by any stretch. There are big gaps in the data. I, for example, once put in one of my former employers, company that's still very well established, employs thousands of people. It just gave me a response that said your data's been archived. But it's a good resource for most people. If you want specifically to look for things like bank accounts, you can try things like My Lost Account. A very good resource that I direct people to is actually just, if you've got a copy of your old CV, go and have a look at your CV. Think about the places that you work. You might not remember them all off the top of your head, but go and have a look at that. Make a note of all of them. Go and rummage around in the loft in boxes of old paperwork. I was doing this when everyone was kind of claiming PPI and using management companies to do it. I came across a box of paperwork in my loft that had an old credit report, in fact, 2 credit reports in it, that were well over a decade old, but in it had every lender that I'd taken out a credit card with. And then from that, I was able to submit my own claims. So sometimes it's the smallest bits of information. It doesn't need to have every piece of information about your account, but at least to have some is an important step forwards.
Yeah, so it's breadcrumbs, as you said.
Absolutely, yeah.
Start. And advice for the entrepreneurs out there. So you've taken an idea from concept to reality in a very short time period through a pandemic and getting mass media exposure and a huge impact on society. Very early in your journey, entrepreneurs out there who've got an idea they want to bring to market. I always say it's 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. I don't know, you can't underestimate the hard work.
Yeah,
but what would be your advice?
Do your research first. Really, really understand your market. Understand the competitors, the pain points. Make sure that what you want to build actually is something that people will buy. You may love it, but it might not be something that people are willing to pay for. When you've made the jump, be brave, do it. Have no fear. Do not be afraid to fail. You know, a lot of businesses will fail. A lot of products will fail. A lot of entrepreneurs will go through an evolution where they'll say, actually, the thing we started out wanting to be 3 years ago isn't where we're going to end up being, because actually the product market fit wasn't quite there and we've evolved. But fail fast. Develop at pace, but always keep in sight what your purpose was. So for us, there are things that we are working on for the future that will help expand our reach, but those things will also continue to support the availability of Gretel as a free service to the public, because that's actually what we set out to solve.
So be clear on your purpose, do the research, product market fit. It comes up on this show all the time.
Yeah.
And move at pace. So yeah, absolutely. Final takeaways. What are you reading or listening to currently?
I'm listening to various array of new rock albums. that's my big thing in terms of reading. I mean, I'd love to say I have lots of time for reading. I generally don't. I get books gifted to me at Christmas. I love it when I can get away on holiday and kind of get through 3 or 4 books in a week. I haven't read a huge amount recently. I've got a whole load of books
Mm.
about kind of leadership in other spheres. I'm a big rugby fan. I grew up playing rugby for many years. So I've got a number of books that have just recently come out from ex-rugby players that I want to kind of get into over Christmas period.
So yeah, adding to your book pile for that much anticipated vacation that's at some point ahead. Yeah,
Whenever it happens, yeah.
I keep doing the same thing. I say I click buy on Amazon. I've got a sort of pile of books that I want to get through, and some of them are half read, and some of them I've never touched. Look, Duncan, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing everything about Gretel. Such an important story. Sharing your journey. Excited about where it's going to go in the future. Really enjoyed the conversation. If folks want to find out more about you or obviously the service, where do they go?
Look, if you want to get in touch with me, look me up on LinkedIn. It's pretty unique as a name what we're doing. So find me on LinkedIn, send me a message. I'll connect with people happily and have a conversation. If people want to look up the business, just go to gretel.co.uk.
Yeah, and sign up. So thank you again, and we'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much.
No worries. Thank you for having me.